Detention After Dark, the terrifying curse that traps students forever. Chapter 1. The Last Bell. Detention. The very word sent shivers down Grace's spine. She had never been to detention before. It wasn't her kind of place. She was the kind of girl who stayed after class to help the teacher. The one who always sat at the front of the room with her hand raised, ready to answer any question. But somehow she'd ended up here. Sitting in a creaky wooden desk, surrounded by the wrong kind of crowd, in a room that smelled faintly of old textbooks and chalk dust. Across the room, Tommy leaned back in his chair, his arms folded across his chest. He had the look of someone who'd been through this routine 100 times before. His leather jacket, torn at the sleeves, screamed rebellion. He'd smirk at Mr. Bricker, roll his eyes, and act like none of this fazed him. If trouble had a face, it would look a lot like Tommy's. Next to him, Kyle kept fidgeting, tapping his fingers on the desk, cracking jokes under his breath. His curly hair bounced with every movement. Even though they were stuck in this dreary situation, Kyle made it his personal mission to lighten the mood. "Hey, Tommy," Kyle whispered, leaning over. "What do you think Mr. Bricker does when he's not torturing kids in detention? You think he's got a secret lab somewhere? Runs into a bat at night?" Tommy snorted, trying to stifle his laughter. Grace gave them both a sharp look. "Do you two ever take anything seriously?" Kyle grinned, leaning back in his chair. "Lighten up, Grace. It's just detention. What's the worst that could happen?" Jenna, sitting quietly at the back of the room, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her pale fingers gripped the edges of her desk like it was a life raft. She didn't say much, she never did, but there was always something about her that seemed off. Maybe it was her fear of the dark. Or the way her eyes darted nervously toward the windows, as if she were expecting something to leap out of the shadows. The silence that followed Kyle's comment was broken by the sound of heavy footsteps. Mr. Bricker entered the room, his face twisted in its usual scowl. He was the kind of teacher who could silence a classroom with just a glare. His tall, gaunt frame moved like a shadow across the room as he slammed the door behind him. The echo reverberated down the empty halls, making the air feel colder. "Sit still, stay quiet, and no one leaves until I say so," Mr. Bricker barked, voice gravelly and stern. His sunken eyes scanned the room, lingering on each student like he was weighing their worth. "You've all earned your time here, so let's not make this any harder than it needs to be." Tommy rolled his eyes. Kyle opened his mouth to crack another joke, but Mr. Bricker shot him a look that could freeze water. Kyle quickly shut up, slumping down in his seat. Grace noticed something odd right away. Normally, detention ended at 5:30, but Mr. Bricker had said they were staying until 6. She glanced at the clock hanging on the wall above the chalkboard. The hands seemed to be stuck, frozen at 5:59. It hadn't moved an inch since they'd arrived. She nudged Tommy, whispering, "Is that clock broken?" "Hasn't moved." Tommy barely glanced at it. "Who cares? Just more time to do nothing." Grace frowned, her stomach twisting with unease. There was something wrong. Something about this detention felt different, off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the heavy silence in the room made her heart beat faster. Mr. Bricker, without another word, walked out of the room, locking the door behind him. The click of the lock sent a chill down Grace's spine. "Well, that's great," Tommy muttered, leaning forward. "We're trapped. Again." Kyle, ever the optimist, pulled out his phone. "Let's see what the world's up to while we're stuck in this dungeon." His smile faded quickly as he glanced at the screen. Guys? No signal." Tommy snorted. "Yeah, because the school's built like a fortress. That's not new." Jenna's voice, barely above a whisper, finally broke the tension. "I don't like this," she said, her eyes wide and focused on the door. "Feels wrong." Grace glanced at her. Jenna was always quiet, but she wasn't usually scared, not like this. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're in here, and we're alone." Jenna's voice trembled. "And it's getting dark." Grace followed Jenna's gaze. Outside the windows, the last bits of daylight were slipping away, casting long shadows across the floor. The hallways beyond the door were already bathed in darkness. The school, usually bustling with students and teachers, felt abandoned. Shallow. Was as if they were the only people left in the building. Suddenly, a noise echoed down the hallway. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They all froze. Tommy stood up, his eyes narrowing. Bricker's coming back. The footsteps didn't stop. They continued, growing louder, closer. Then, silence. The air felt heavy, like the room was holding its breath. Kyle, trying to play it cool, smirked. Maybe it's the janitor, or a ghost. Grace glared at him. This isn't funny, Kyle. The footsteps resumed, but this time they were accompanied by something else. A whisper, faint voice, barely audible, seemed to slither through the cracks in the door. It wasn't clear enough to understand, but the eerie tone made the hairs on Grace's neck stand up. Jenna pressed herself against the back wall, her breath quickening. "I told you, something's not right." Tommy, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "Relax, it's probably just the wind or the building settling." But even he didn't sound convinced. The clock still hadn't moved. The hands remained stuck at 5:59, as if time itself had decided to stop. Grace swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to get out of here." Tommy scoffed. "How?" Bricker locked the door. Kyle, his voice uncharacteristically tense, stood up. "Maybe there's another way out. We could try the windows." Grace looked at the windows. The darkness outside seemed impenetrable. Still, anything was better than sitting here, waiting for whatever was out there. "Let's at least try." The group moved toward the windows, their footsteps eerily loud in the stillness of the room. Tommy tugged on the window latch, but it wouldn't budge. He grunted, pulling harder, but it was no use. The windows were locked. Kyle tried the next one. Same result. Grace felt a pit form in her stomach. They were trapped. Another noise echoed from the hallway. This time it was unmistakable, a low, guttural moan. Not a person, not human, something else. Jenna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "We're not alone." Grace's heart raced. The whispers grew louder and the footsteps resumed, pacing just outside the door. Whatever was out there, it was coming closer, and they were running out of time. Chapter 2. Locked in. Tommy's hands were still gripping the window frame when the low moan reverberated through the classroom once more. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something or someone was out there in the darkened hallways, and it wasn't Mr. Bricker. "Okay, that wasn't funny," Tommy muttered, letting go of the latch. His usual bravado was slipping, and everyone could feel it. Even Kyle, who had been making light of the situation moments before, starting to look uneasy. Grace, clutching her phone tightly, turned away from the locked windows. "We need to get help, now." She pressed her phone to her ear, hoping that maybe, somehow she could get a signal, but the screen remained dark. No bars, no connection. "Nothing," she whispered, voice tight with anxiety. Kyle, ever the joker, tried to mask his growing fear. "Come on, guys, this is just some dumb prank. Maybe the janitor's messing with us, or Mr. Bricker's getting his kicks, creeping us out. Probably out there right now, watching us freak out." He walked over to the classroom door and knocked loudly on it. "Hey, Bricker, you can stop now, all right? Joke's over." They all waited, tension in the air thick enough to slice. Silence. Then suddenly, an answering knock came from the other side of the door. Tommy froze. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Jenna let out a quiet gasp, and Kyle, who had been standing closest to the door, took an instinctive step back. Did you guys hear that?" Kyle stammered, the color draining from his face. Tommy, recovering quickly, narrowed his eyes. "Yeah, we heard it, but it's probably just the wind or something." He moved toward the door, placing his hand on the handle. "I'll prove it to you." He yanked the door open, fully expecting to see Mr. Bricker standing there with a smug grin, or maybe nothing at all. But the hallway outside was empty. There was no janitor, no Mr. Bricker, nothing but flickering overhead lights and long, stretching shadows. Kyle leaned out into the hall, his nervous smile slipping away entirely. "Okay, so, that's a little creepy." Grace stepped forward, her eyes scanning the hall. The fluorescent lights above them flickered erratically, casting the walls in strange, shifting patterns. The whole school felt abandoned, forgotten, as if everyone else had left for the day, and they were the only ones who hadn't gotten the memo. Tommy scowled and turned back to the group. "Look, we're not going to sit around and wait for something to happen. Let's just find another way out. Break a window if we have to." Jenna, her voice barely above a whisper, added, "But what if we're not alone?" Tommy brushed her concern aside. "Come on, Jenna. There's no one else here. It's just a locked school and a creepy old building. We've been through worse." Grace, ignoring Tommy's forced confidence, said, "We need to split up and find an exit. There's got to be another way out besides the front door." She looked at her phone again. Still no signal. "And maybe, just maybe, we'll find a place where we can get a call out." Kyle, trying to regain some of his humor, added, "Yeah, split up. That always works in the movies." "No, we're sticking together," Grace insisted. "We'll search the classrooms one by one." Tommy sighed, clearly frustrated. "Fine, but if we don't find anything, I'm breaking that window." 4 of them stepped out into the hallway, the door slamming shut behind them with a loud bang. The sound echoed down the long, empty corridor, making them all flinch. As they moved down the hallway, their footsteps seemed to grow louder, bouncing off the walls in eerie, unpredictable ways. Shadows shifted at the edge of their vision, darting away whenever they tried to focus on them. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. The school felt wrong, like it had come alive around them, warping into something unfamiliar and dangerous. Kyle approached one of the classrooms and tugged on the handle. Lock. He laughed nervously, turning back to the group. "Well, this is just great. We're stuck in detention and now locked out of all the other rooms too." Suddenly, the lights flickered again, this time more violently, plunging them into brief pockets of darkness before blinking back to life. Grace's breath hitched. Maybe it's just a power surge. It's an old building, right? "Yeah, sure," Tommy muttered. "Just a coincidence." But even Tommy didn't sound convinced. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on them, suffocating any attempt at humor or reason. As they moved further down the hall, the noises started again. Faint footsteps, soft whispers, just out of earshot. It was as if the school itself was alive, watching them, waiting for something. Tommy stopped at the end of the hallway, where another set of windows looked out into the courtyard. "If we can't find a door, we'll break one of these." He leaned against the glass, inspecting the window, then drew his fist back, ready to smash it open. "Tommy, wait!" Grace started, but it was too late. He swung his fist forward, connecting with the glass. Instead of shattering, though, the window remained intact, completely unscathed. Tommy stared at his fist in disbelief, then hit the window again. Harder this time. Nothing. The glass didn't even crack. "What the?" Tommy swore under his breath and pounded the window with both fists, harder and harder. Still, it didn't budge. Grace approached, placing a hand on his arm. "It's no use. Something's wrong with this place. We need to find another way out." Kyle, standing nearby, rubbed his arms as if trying to warm himself. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore. Is there seriously no way out? We're locked in a school. This should be easy." But it wasn't easy. No matter how many doors they tried, each one was locked tight. Even the janitor's closet, place that was always open, was sealed shut. Jenna's voice wavered as she spoke, barely louder than a whisper. "We're trapped." Tommy clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "No, we're not. There's got to be a way out of here. We just need to." Suddenly, the lights flickered again, this time staying off longer. The hallway plunged into darkness, and for a few heart-stopping moments, they were surrounded by nothing but pitch black. Then, just as abruptly, the lights flickered back to life. Only now, the hallway wasn't empty. A shadow, a tall, indistinct figure, stood at the far end of the corridor, motionless. Its head was tilted as if watching them. There was no face, no discernible features, just a dark, looming silhouette against the flickering lights. Jenna let out a small, terrified squeak, clutching Grace's arm tightly. What is that?" No one answered. They were all too frozen, too shocked by the sudden appearance of the figure. The air seemed to grow colder, the atmosphere thicker with an oppressive, suffocating dread. And then the figure moved, slowly, steadily, toward them. "Run," Tommy yelled, grabbing Kyle by the arm and pulling him toward the stairwell at the end of the hallway. They bolted, their footsteps echoing loudly in the silent school. The shadow seemed to follow, always staying just behind them, moving faster than should have been possible. Grace's lungs burned as they reached the stairwell. Tommy yanked open the door, and they all scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind them. They leaned against the door, their breaths ragged and panicked. For a few moments, everything was quiet again. The only sound was the pounding of their hearts, the echo of their breathing in the narrow stairwell. We need to get out of here," Grace gasped, her chest heaving. "That thing, it's not human." Tommy nodded, his face pale but determined. We're getting out of here, one way or another. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The school wasn't going to let them leave. Chapter 3. The Vanishing. The stairwell felt colder than it should have, air thick with an almost suffocating chill. They stood there, catching their breath, hearts still pounding from their narrow escape. For a brief moment, silence enveloped the group. But it was a silence filled with dread. Tommy leaned against the wall, rubbing his face with his hands, the frustration and fear finally showing through. "We have to move," Grace whispered, though the sound seemed louder in the oppressive quiet. She cast a nervous glance at the door they just slammed behind them. That thing might come back. Kyle nodded, still breathing heavily, but his usual bravado was gone. He wasn't cracking jokes anymore. Jenna, however, was standing a bit off to the side, her eyes wide and darting around the stairwell as if she could sense something the others couldn't. "Jenna?" Grace asked, stepping toward her. "You okay?" Jenna didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at Grace, then looked back at the darkened stairwell ahead of them. I don't like this place," she finally muttered, her voice barely audible. "None of us do," Tommy said, pushing himself off the wall. "But we're not staying here. We have to find a way out, or we're sitting ducks." Grace nodded, taking charge. "We need to stick together. No more splitting up. We find an exit, no matter how long it takes." They filed out of the stairwell, the dimly lit hallway ahead stretching into shadows. Flickering lights made everything look distorted, as if the walls themselves were shifting, warping into something unfamiliar. The school had become a maze, and it seemed to stretch further than it ever had during the day. As they walked, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled with an unsettling sensation, and every creak of the floor, every distant whisper, made her heart skip a beat. Kyle broke the silence, his voice unusually quiet. "You think we're, cursed? Like maybe this school's haunted or something?" Tommy rolled his eyes, but there was no confidence behind the gesture. "No such thing as ghosts, man. There's gotta be a logical explanation for all this." But even as Tommy spoke, none of them truly believed it. They turned down another hallway, the lockers lining the walls, standing like sentinels, their doors slightly ajar as if they'd been disturbed. Grace couldn't help but glance at each one as they passed, half expecting something, or someone, to leap out at them. Jenna walked quietly beside Grace, her eyes downcast. She hadn't spoken much since they left the stairwell, her usual quiet demeanor now bordering on eerily detached. Grace noticed, but before she could ask what was wrong, Jenna suddenly stopped. "Wait. Do you hear that?" Jenna whispered, her voice barely a breath. Kyle leaned over her shoulder, his voice shaking. "What? What happened to them?" Grace turned another page, her stomach nodding as she saw more and more faded faces. "I don't know," he whispered, "but it's like they were erased." Tommy's voice came from behind them, hard and determined. "This place is cursed. We need to get out, now." Suddenly, one of the lockers creaked open behind them, its rusted hinges groaning in the silence. They all spun around, staring at it. The locker stood ajar, its dark interior empty, except for a single piece of paper fluttering inside. Kyle swallowed hard. "I'm not touching that." Grace, ignoring the growing pit of fear in her stomach, stepped forward and cautiously pulled the paper from the locker. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, revealing a cryptic, scribbled message. "You are not alone. It's watching you." Her heart raced, and she held the note out for the others to see. "What does this mean?" Tommy clenched his jaw, his eyes darting around the hallway. "It means we need to move. Now." But as they turned to leave, Jenna's voice echoed again through the hall. This time louder, more urgent. "Please." They froze, their fear taking root deep inside them. It sounded like Jenna was right around the corner, but when they rounded the bend, there was no one there. Just the same dark, endless hallway, stretching out ahead of them like a nightmare that had no end. Tommy slammed his fist against the wall. "Where is she? Why does her voice keep moving?" Grace's mind raced. "It's like the school is playing with us. It's moving things around, changing things." Kyle's eyes widened in fear. "Then how do we find her?" Grace didn't have an answer. All she knew was that Jenna was somewhere in this twisted, haunted place, and if they didn't find her soon, she might disappear for good. The group halted, straining their ears. At first, there was nothing but the eerie hum of the flickering lights. But then, faintly, they all heard it. A voice, a distant, soft cry for help. "Help me!" Grace felt her blood run cold. It was Jenna's voice, but Jenna was standing right next to her. They all turned to look at Jenna, but her face was blank, her lips not moving. "What the?" Tommy muttered, his eyes wide with confusion. Before anyone could react, Jenna took a single step forward and vanished. One moment she was there, standing beside them, and the next she was simply gone, as if she'd been plucked out of existence. No sound, no flash of light, no warning. Just gone. "Jenna!" Grace screamed, rushing to the spot where her friend had been standing. She reached out, her hands grabbing at empty air, her heart pounding in her chest. "Jenna!" Tommy ran over, looking around wildly. "What the hell just happened? Where is she?" Kyle backed up against the lockers, his face pale as a sheet. She was right there. She was just right there. Grace's heart raced. This was more than just a trick of the school. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. "Jenna," she called again, her voice shaking. And then they heard it. Jenna's voice again, faint and echoing, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the walls. "Oh, please, help me." Tommy's fists clenched at his sides. "We have to find her. She's trapped somewhere. We can't leave her." Grace nodded, though panic was setting in. They couldn't leave Jenna behind. But where was she? How could she just vanish like that? And the voice, it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, as if the school itself was toying with them. "We'll find her," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We have to stay calm and figure this out." Tommy, however, was anything but calm. "This is my fault," he muttered, his voice low. "It pushed us to keep going. If we hadn't left the classroom, if we just stayed put." "Don't do that," Grace interrupted firmly. "This isn't your fault, Tommy. Whatever's happening here, it's beyond any of us. We need to focus on finding Jenna." But as they continued down the hall, the school seemed to be working against them. Corridors twisted, and doors that should have led to familiar places instead opened into empty rooms or dead ends. Even the yearbook cabinet, something so ordinary during daylight hours, now appeared sinister. Grace paused in front of it, her hand resting on the glass, staring at the dusty, faded covers of old-school yearbooks. Something about them seemed wrong. She pulled one from the shelf and flipped it open, her fingers trembling slightly as she skimmed through the pages. The photographs inside were old, the students' faces blurry and smudged as if time itself had erased them. Some of the faces were completely gone, just empty spaces where eyes and smiles should have been. Chapter 4. The Chilling Secret. The air in the basement was thick with dust, the faint light from their phones casting eerie shadows on the walls. Each footstep echoed strangely, making the cold stone floor feel even more desolate. Grace shivered as they moved deeper into the musty room they had just stumbled upon. It was a forgotten part of the school, untouched for what looked like decades, and the weight of the past seemed to press down on them with every passing second. "Where are we?" Tommy muttered, his voice sounding distant, as if the room swallowed his words before they could fully reach the others. Kyle, who had been nervously fiddling with his flashlight, shone it across the room. Dusty shelves lined the walls, stacked with old books, yellowed papers, and strange, broken relics. The air was stale, the smell of decay lingering like a warning. Grace stepped forward, her eyes scanning the shelves. "This place, it's like it hasn't been touched in years." Her voice trembled, but there was a fascination in her tone. She reached out to brush away the cobwebs covering an old photograph. Kyle leaned over her shoulder. "What do you think this is? Some kind of storage room?" He tried to sound casual, but his eyes darted nervously around the dimly lit space. Tommy's gaze was fixed on something in the corner. "Look at this." He pulled out a framed photograph from a pile of debris, holding it up to the light. The photo showed a group of students standing in front of the school. Their clothes were old-fashioned, their expressions stiff. But there at the center of the group stood a man they all recognized instantly, Mr. Bricker. But something was wrong. The photo was dated over 50 years ago, and yet Mr. Bricker looked exactly the same as he did today. Grace took the frame from Tommy, Grace, her heart pounding as she examined it closer. "This can't be possible," she whispered, running her finger over the faded image. "He hasn't aged, not even a little." Tommy crossed his arms, a deep frown creasing his brow. "That's not normal. What's going on here?" Kyle took a step back, his eyes wide. "You're telling me Mr. Bricker's some kind of, what, immortal? Vampire?" Grace shook her head, trying to make sense of it. "No, but something's not right. This place, this school, there's a secret, a dark one." Tommy picked up an old, crumbling ledger from one of the shelves and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the yellowed pages. "Look at this. It's a record of detentions, dates, names, punishments." He flipped further through the book, his expression darkening. "All these kids, they never left. They just disappeared." Grace felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "What do you mean, disappeared?" Tommy's voice was grim. "I mean, they were marked as missing after being assigned detention. None of them were ever found. And look at this. Mr. Bricker was their supervisor. Every single time." Kyle took a step back, his face pale. "You're saying this isn't the first time students have vanished in this school?" Grace closed the ledger, her fingers trembling. "It's like the school is cursed. Anyone who stays after dark, anyone caught in detention, gets trapped here. Just like those kids. And just like us," Tommy added, his voice low. "We're next." Suddenly, a cold gust of air swept through the room, flickering the weak light from their phones. Grace shivered, feeling the temperature drop drastically. The atmosphere in the room shifted, as if something was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "We need to get out of here," Grace whispered, her voice shaking. As if on cue, a faint scraping sound echoed from the far end of the basement. Kyle froze, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Before anyone could respond, the scraping grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of something dragging itself across the floor, slow and deliberate, like it was closing in on them. The shadows seemed to shift, crawling toward them with malevolent intent. "We have to go, now," Tommy hissed, his voice tight with fear. They bolted toward the door, but just as they reached the threshold, Kyle let out a sharp gasp. "Wait, my backpack." He turned back, his eyes darting around the room. "Kyle, forget it," Grace called, grabbing his arm, but Kyle pulled free, stumbling back toward the darkened corner where his bag had been. "I need it. There's something important." Before anyone could stop him, Kyle vanished. One moment he was there, standing just a few feet away, and the next he was gone. The room seemed to swallow him whole, the air still thick with the echoes of his panicked breath. "Kyle!" Tommy shouted, his voice raw with terror. He ran to where Kyle had been standing, frantically searching the floor, the walls, the shadows, but there was no trace of him. No scream, no struggle, just the faint sound of his backpack hitting the ground. Grace's heart pounded in her chest, her throat tightening with fear. He's gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tommy picked up Kyle's abandoned backpack, his hands shaking. "What is this place?" he growled through clenched teeth. "What's happening?" Grace backed away from the corner, her eyes wide with panic. "It's the school. It's hunting us, just like it did with those other kids." Tommy's expression hardened, but Grace could see the fear in his eyes. "We need to get back to the classroom," said, voice tight. "It's the only place we've been safe so far." Without waiting for a response, Tommy turned and sprinted toward the stairwell. Grace followed closely behind, her heart racing, every step filled with the weight of Kyle's disappearance. The shadows seemed to close in on them, stretching and twisting as if the school itself was alive, reaching for them, trying to pull them into its darkness. They reached the top of the stairs and ran down the hallway, their footsteps echoing through the empty school. The flickering lights above cast long, distorted shadows, making everything look warped, unreal. Grace's breath came in ragged gasps as she fought to keep up with Tommy, the fear gripping her tightly. Finally, they burst into the classroom, slamming the door behind them. For a moment, everything was still. The classroom looked the same as it had when they'd left it. Desks neatly arranged, chairs pushed in, the clock still frozen at 5:59. But the oppressive silence weighed down on them, as if the school was waiting for them to make their next move. Grace leaned against the door, her heart pounding. "What do we do now?" Tommy ran a hand through his hair, pacing the length of the classroom. "We can't stay here. The longer we're in this school, the more dangerous it gets. We need to find a way out. There's got to be something we're missing. Grace nodded, her mind racing. We need to think. If the school is cursed, if it's trapping us here, then there must be a way to break the curse. Tommy stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes narrowing. How? Grace swallowed hard, her thoughts tumbling over one another. I don't know, but there has to be something. Maybe we can find a clue. Something in the records or in the yearbooks. Tommy grabbed one of the dusty yearbooks from the shelf and slammed it onto a desk. We don't have time for this. We need to act now. Grace took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Tommy, I know you're scared. I am too. But if we don't figure this out, we're going to end up like the others. Like Kyle, like Jenna. Tommy's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't argue. He sat down at the desk, flipping through the old yearbook with angry, jerky movements. Grace moved to the window, her eyes scanning the darkened schoolyard outside. But the night was still, unnaturally quiet, as if the world outside the school had vanished. As she stared into the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the flickering lights, waiting for them to make a mistake. And she knew, deep down, that they were running out of time. Chapter 5. The final countdown. The ticking of the classroom clock echoed in the silence, each second louder than the last, as if time itself was counting down to something terrible. Tommy and Grace sat huddled near the teacher's desk, their nerves frayed from hours of searching and the weight of their friends' disappearances hanging heavy in the air. Grace clutched the cryptic note she had found, her hands trembling as she read it for the 10th time. The faded, spidery handwriting of Mr. Bricker seemed to mock them. The curse can only be broken if you survive until dawn. Tommy paced back and forth across the room, his mind racing, his movements agitated. This can't be it, he muttered. There's got to be another way out of this. We can't just sit here waiting for the sun to rise. Grace looked up from the note, her voice shaky but determined. Tommy, I've been thinking about it. What if we're not supposed to survive by just waiting? What if there's more to it? Maybe the only way to end this is to confront Mr. Bricker directly. He's at the center of all of this. Tommy stopped pacing, face twisted in frustration. Confront a ghost. Grace, that's insane. We don't even know if he's still human. What if he's, I don't know, some kind of monster now? We're dealing with things we don't understand. Grace stood up, her voice rising. But what other choice do we have? You saw the photograph, the yearbooks, all the clues we found. Everything points to him. He's been here for decades, keeping this curse alive. If we don't face him, we'll end up just like Kyle and Jenna. She swallowed hard, her eyes welling up, but she didn't let the tears fall. We have to do something, Tommy. Tommy looked at her, his defiance faltering. He knew she was right. They couldn't just wait around while the school's dark power closed in on them. The ghostly footsteps they'd heard earlier were growing louder, closer, as if whatever haunted the halls was circling them, tightening its grip. Okay, Tommy finally said, his voice quiet. But how do we confront someone or something that isn't even alive? Grace took a deep breath, her mind racing. Maybe we can lure him out, force him to come to us. She gestured toward the door, where they had heard the footsteps moments ago. If we make it clear that we know about the curse, that we know he's behind it, he might reveal himself. Tommy frowned, clearly unsure. And what if he does? What then? How do we stop him? Grace glanced back at the note, running her fingers over the words. I don't know, but if the curse is tied to him, maybe we can break it by confronting him. Or, she hesitated, as if the thought terrified her, maybe we have to stop him, somehow, for good. Tommy shivered. You're talking about going up against a ghost, Grace. Yes, Grace replied firmly, her voice steadier now, but it's the only chance we've got. Before Tommy could respond, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before they sputtered back on. The temperature dropped sharply, and the familiar sound of footsteps echoed once again through the empty hallway outside the classroom. Only this time, they were unmistakably coming closer. Grace and Tommy exchanged a look. There was no turning back now. We need to go, Grace whispered. Now. Together, they crept toward the door, their movements cautious, hearts pounding in their chests. Grace's hand hovered over the doorknob, cold metal sending a chill through her skin. She turned to Tommy one last time, her expression resolute. "No matter what happens, we stick together. Agreed?" Tommy nodded, though fear flickered in his eyes. "Agreed?" With a quick, deep breath, Grace opened the door, and they stepped out into the shadowy hallway. The school felt even more oppressive now, the walls seeming to close in on them, as if the building itself was alive, waiting for the moment to trap them forever. The footsteps echoed all around, growing louder and louder, filling the empty space with their unnatural rhythm. Grace's pulse quickened as they approached the main corridor where the sound seemed to be originating. The cold air stung her skin, and her breath puffed out in visible wisps. Suddenly, the ticking of the classroom clock stopped. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like the world had frozen. And then, just ahead of them, a figure appeared in the shadows. Mr. Bricker. But this wasn't the same stern-faced teacher they had seen in the hallways earlier. His once human form now flickered and twisted, his body shrouded in darkness. His face was gaunt, pale, his eyes hollow and glowing faintly in the dim light. He wasn't alive, not anymore. He was something far worse. Tommy let out a gasp, stepping back. This can't be real. Grace stood frozen, her mind racing, trying to push through the fear that was threatening to overwhelm her. She took a tentative step forward, her voice shaking but strong. "Mr. Bricker, we know about the curse. We know what happened all those years ago." The shadowy figure didn't respond, but the air around him seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the cold growing even more intense. "You're trapped here," Grace continued, her voice growing bolder. "Just like those students. You don't have to do this. You don't have to keep taking more victims. It's over." For a moment it seemed like the figure hesitated, but then with a low, guttural growl, surged toward them. Tommy shouted, pulling Grace back just as the figure reached for them with icy, skeletal hands. They stumbled backward, crashing into the wall, their hearts racing as the shadowy form loomed closer. Grace's mind spun, desperate to figure out what to do. She glanced at Tommy, who was gripping the edge of a desk for support, his face pale with terror. There had to be a way to stop this, something they were missing. Then she remembered the note. "Survive until dawn." Her eyes darted to the window at the end of the hallway. Outside, the sky was still pitch black, but dawn couldn't be far off. If they could just last until then. "Tommy," she shouted, grabbing his arm. "We need to get to the front of the school. We need to hold him off until the sun rises." "But how?" Tommy yelled back, his voice laced with panic. Grace didn't have an answer, but as Mr. Bricker drew closer, his hollow eyes glowing with malicious intent, she knew they had no choice. With a burst of adrenaline, they bolted down the hallway, the icy chill of the figure's presence hot on their heels. Doors slammed shut behind them, as if the school itself was trying to trap them. The walls seemed to stretch and bend, the dark corridors winding in directions they'd never noticed before. The very building was fighting them. As they reached the front lobby, Grace could see the faintest hint of light beginning to creep into the sky. Dawn was coming. They just had to survive a little longer. The figure was still behind them, its presence pressing down like a weight on their chests. But something shifted as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce through the gloom. Mr. Bricker hesitated, his form flickering as if the light was weakening him. Grace grabbed Tommy's arm, pulling him toward the entrance. "Look, he's fading." They pressed themselves against the glass doors, watching as Mr. Bricker's figure twisted and contorted, the light from the rising sun burning away the shadows that clung to him. With a final, haunting cry, Mr. Bricker vanished, dissolving into the morning air. The chill lifted, and the oppressive silence was replaced by the distant sound of birds chirping outside. They had survived. Curse was broken. For now. Chapter 6. Escape or Eternity. The school hallways seemed to stretch endlessly as Grace and Tommy made their way through the dim, flickering lights. Every corner they turned, every door they passed, carried the weight of the students who had disappeared before them, swallowed by the darkness that permeated the cursed building. The school was alive with a restless, unseen energy. Doors creaked on their own, lockers rattled, and the faint echo of whispers bounced off the walls, growing louder with each step they took. Tommy's face was pale, but his jaw was set, his mind racing with a mix of fear and determination. Grace glanced at him, trying to summon a courage she didn't quite feel. She knew they were nearing the end. The final confrontation was inevitable. Mr. Bricker, or whatever he had become, was waiting for them. "We can't run forever," Tommy whispered, more to himself than to Grace. His voice was tight, as if the realization had finally settled in his chest. "We're not getting out of here by just avoiding him." Grace nodded, her thoughts mirroring his. She had been trying to piece together the fragments of the curse, clues left behind by the vanished students, and the message in Mr. Bricker's cryptic note. Now, she knew. It wasn't about escaping. It was about facing the curse head-on. As they reached the basement stairs, Tommy stopped, his hand hovering over the railing. The air down here was colder, heavier, as though it had absorbed decades of fear and suffering. Grace felt it too, the weight of something unseen, something watching. "This is it," she whispered, gripping Tommy's arm. "He's down there. We have to end this." Tommy hesitated, his eyes scanning the darkness below. "What if we can't? What if we just disappear like the others?" Grace swallowed hard. She had no answer to that. But running wasn't an option anymore. "We have to try." With that, they descended into the basement. The air was thick with dust, the scent of decay lingering in the stale atmosphere. As they reached the bottom, they were met with a door they hadn't seen before. It was old, its wood cracked and splintered, as though it hadn't been opened in decades. Without a word, Grace pushed it open. Inside was the rune from Mr. Bricker's past. The relics of a forgotten time lined the shelves. Dusty books, faded photographs, and ancient papers scattered across the floor. In the middle of the room stood a single desk, Mr. Bricker's desk, and behind it, he waited. The figure that had once been Mr. Bricker was barely recognizable now. His form was a distorted shadow, hovering between the real and the unreal, his eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. His presence was suffocating, as though the darkness itself had taken shape. "I've been waiting for you," Mr. Bricker rasped, his voice like nails on a chalkboard, his eyes fixed on Grace and Tommy, cold and unfeeling. "You think you can escape this? You think you can break the curse?" Grace stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "We know what you did," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "We know about the students who disappeared. We know about the curse." Mr. Bricker's form flickered, as though the very mention of his past had unsettled him. "You don't know anything," he snarled. "This place, this school, it's mine. It's always been mine. And you'll join the others before dawn breaks." Tommy clenched his fists, stepping up beside Grace. "We're not running," he said firmly. "We're not like the others." Mr. Bricker let out a low, guttural laugh. "You'll vanish just like them. There's no escape." Grace's mind raced, her thoughts swirling as the truth began to crystallize. "It's not about escaping," she whispered, her eyes widening as the pieces fell into place. "The students who disappeared, they were trying to run. That's why the curse never broke. It's not about surviving until dawn. It's about sacrifice." Tommy looked at her, confused. "Sacrifice?" Grace turned to him, voice urgent. "The only way to break the curse is for someone to stay behind. The students who vanished, they tried to run, but the curse demands that someone face it. Someone has to give themselves up." Tommy's eyes widened in realization, the weight of her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "You mean, one of us?" Grace nodded slowly, throat tight. "Yes, one of us has to stay." For a long moment, silence hung between them, the reality of the situation sinking in. Tommy's gaze flicked to the door behind them. Door to freedom, but he knew what Grace was saying was true. He knew there was no escaping the school's curse without a price. "I'll do it," Tommy said suddenly, his voice low but firm. Grace's eyes widened. "Tommy, no?" "I have to, Grace." Tommy's voice was steady, but his eyes were filled with emotion. "It's the only way. If one of us stays, the other can go. You can go. You can break the curse." Grace shook her head, her heart clenching in her chest. "No, Tommy, we do this together. I'm not leaving you behind." Tommy looked at her, a sad smile on his face. "You have to. If both of us try to leave, we'll both disappear. This is the only way." Mr. Bricker's shadowy form loomed closer, the darkness around him pulsing with power. "It's too late," whispered. "One of you must stay." Grace's mind spun with desperation, but deep down, she knew Tommy was right. curse could only be broken through sacrifice. But as she looked at her friend, standing there with such courage, she couldn't bear the thought of leaving him behind. "Tommy, He started, but before she could finish, Tommy reached out and grabbed her hand. "Go, Grace. You have to go?" he said softly. "I'll stay." The air around them grew colder as Mr. Bricker stepped closer, his presence suffocating. Tommy took a deep breath, preparing to face his fate. But just as the darkness began to swirl around him, Grace's grip tightened. "No," she shouted, her voice breaking. "I'm not leaving you." In that moment, something shifted. The darkness that had been closing in on Tommy faltered, as if Grace's refusal to abandon him had disrupted the curse's hold. The swirling shadows paused, and Mr. Bricker's form flickered violently, as though the curse itself was unraveling. Grace's eyes widened. "Tommy, don't you see? The curse isn't about sacrifice, it's about selflessness. It's about us refusing to let it tear us apart." Mr. Bricker let out a furious growl, his form distorting as the first rays of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the walls. The darkness around him shattered like glass, dissolving into nothingness. Grace and Tommy held on to each other as the school around them seemed to come alive, the oppressive weight lifting, air clearing. The doors that had been locked swung open, and the whispers that had tormented them faded into silence. Curse was broken. But as they stepped out into the morning light, breathing in the fresh air of freedom, something didn't feel right. The sky was clear, the sun rising in the distance, but the world around them felt off. Tommy glanced at his watch, his heart sinking. The hands were frozen, stuck at 5:59. He turned to Grace, his voice trembling. "Grace, the clock hasn't moved." Grace pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she unlocked the screen. Her blood ran cold as she saw the message waiting for her. "Detention isn't over yet." Her heart stopped. It wasn't over. Not yet.